Thank you all for being here. This is the second of the Jewish Studies lecture series here at La Pietra Policy Dialogues. And today, with my colleague Arturo Marzano, we're going to deal or tackle the issue of 1948 in Israel and Palestine. And this is it's a timely talk, I think, because this is the 70th anniversary of the foundation of the State of Israel on the one hand, and of the Palestinian Nakba on the other. And so we are trying to look at 1948 as a moment in this century-long war of the Middle East. Just a few words of introduction. I'll start with myself, and then I will give the microphone to my colleague. So my name is Marcella Simoni. I'm sorry for those of you who have already heard it, but so my name is Marcella Simoni. I teach here at NYU a course on the history of European Jews, and I teach at the University of Venice in Italy. And there I teach, in fact, history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. I have written a little bit about this. In particular, I've done my dissertation in London many years ago on the British Mandate, and then I published a book about that. And I've written on a couple of journals, various things connected to Israel and Palestine. So this is Arturo Marzano.
Okay. Should I turn on the no, is it on?
It's on.
Hi. So as Marcella said, I'm Arturo Marzano. I'm very happy to be here. I teach at University of Pisa. History of the Middle East and history of the Arab-Israeli conflict. I try to engage with these issues. I have been studying these things for the last 20-25 years. My Ph.D. was actually on the Italian Jewish migration to British Palestine. And then recently I focused on a radio transmitting in Arabic towards the Middle East from Rome Bari called Radio Bari.
Great. Thank you very much. So, yeah, I'm sorry, sure?
Before we begin, I just wanted to say that the Middle East Festival is coming up in April. It's from April 10th to 15th. And as Marcella Simoni said, there will be multiple discussion groups. Some of you were already a part of it. Some of you might be eventually interested. I'm going to pass flyers around with dates. And thank you. I will be passing flyers around with dates on it if anyone is interested. And there will also be a special opportunity to join the jury if you are an NYU student. So contact us if you're interested. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, there's a Middle East Film Festival coming up, which is, I don't know if you know it, it's a great opportunity for a full immersion in the Middle East for a few days. It's like traveling to the Middle East without leaving Florence. And it's really a great opportunity. It's a rare opportunity in Italy, I would say, for this kind of festivals. And yeah, full immersions. So let's start with Israel and Palestine at 70. And I think that the first, this is going to work as a sort of an interview. We're going to interview one another, ask questions to one another, and see what comes out. So the war of 1948 starts actually from a UN resolution, which is Resolution 181, which, this is the map of Resolution 181 that sanctions the partition of Palestine. So we're in 1947, 29th of November. And my first question to you, Arturo, is how do we get to the UN splitting up Palestine? And you know, how did this happen?
So actually we're coming from the other room and we were talking about two different nationalists competing on the same place. So the Zionism and the Palestinian nationalism. So the clashes between the two groups start basically since the beginning of the mandate. So starting from 1920, we have slowly an increase of clashes. And the situation becomes particularly difficult, in particular in 1936, 1939. So once the war is over, it is very difficult for the British to bring peace to Palestine. So we are in a situation of post-Second World War. The British Empire is not simple. Great Britain understands that they really cannot keep the empire. So in 1947, there's the decision to retreat from India. We were talking about the Pearl Empire. And London understands that it's too difficult to keep Palestine. They don't basically have money to keep police and the army in Palestine. So what they do, as Marcella was saying, they decide to give back Palestine or the Palestine issue to the new League of Nations, to the United Nations. So in February 1947, London says, look, UN, you have to deal with this situation. And the United Nations create a committee, which is called UNSCOP, United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, which is composed of 11 members, which was the amount of members of the Security Council at the time. Today we have 15 members, at the time there were 11. So the first decision was which members should be appointed, and there was lots of discussion, should I be there, who should be part, which state should be part of the UNSCOP. And in the end, the 11 members are chosen among countries who were perceived as not to compromise with neither of the two sides. A small list: Australia, Canada, Czechoslovakia, Guatemala, India, Iran, Netherlands, Peru, Sweden, Uruguay, Yugoslavia. So what does this UNSCOP committee does? Members go to the country, to Palestine, and start talking and interviewing people to understand what to do with Palestine. And what comes out at the end of their presence, they were supposed to be there between May, 26th of May, and 31st of August. So at the end of August, basically there are two different opinions that comes out. One opinion is a federal state. The idea of what shall we do with Palestine after Britain gives independence, a federal state to allow these two people, the Arab Palestinians and the Jewish Palestinians, stay together in a federal state. And of course, the main supporter of this federal opinion was, and I think we should not be too much surprised, Yugoslavia. Because Yugoslavia was basically saying, okay, let's do what we are doing home. Iran and India are the ones who support the federal option. But all the other members support the other option, which is partition, according to that map. So the blue is the yet to be a Jewish state. The orange was the yet to become an Arab state, and there's a third white spot, which is the so-called Corpus Separatum, which was basically the holy sites, basically Jerusalem and Bethlehem. So once the committee has to decide which of the two options, once they have to vote, in the end, the partition is adopted. So UNSCOP goes back to the UN Assembly, saying, Assembly, hi, this is what I've done, so we have selected this partition plan. It is up to you to vote. And during basically September and October, there's a huge discussion among the UN members because you have some who support partitions and some who don't support partition. So you have a big attempt to take as much as vote as possible to win the solution, so whether to vote for this partition plan or to vote against. November 29 is the day in which the United Nations Assembly meets, and in the end, 33 states voted in favor of the adoption of the partition plan. 10 states abstained, among which Great Britain, that wanted to say, well, I'm not taking any position. Yugoslavia, for example, also abstained, and the others were against. So the United Nations decided to adopt the partition plan. I think that what is important to remember is that in that occasion, November 47, both the USSR and the US vote in favor of the partition. And as I often ask to my students, are you surprised that both countries voted in favor? So when my students say, no, we're not surprised, I actually say, you should be surprised, because if we probably know, the Cold War has basically already started. Of course, nothing starts on a date, but if people pick up a date for the beginning of the Cold War, people will probably choose March 12, the Truman Doctrine. So it means that despite USSR and US are really in an uneasy feeling situation, they both vote in favor. So why do they both vote in favor? And this is very interesting because each of them voted for different reasons. Actually, in the US, it was very difficult to get to a decision because the president of the United States at that time, Harry Truman, was very much in favor of adopting the partition. But the Secretary of State was against, because the Secretary of State was afraid that adopting the partition, Arab countries, Saudi Arabia, where is the word? Okay, somewhere, and other countries would probably be disappointed, and therefore, given that oil was at that time at stake, that US would probably suffer from a problem in terms of relation with the Arab worlds. But for Truman, it was very important to choose the partition. He wanted to give the Jews a state, and one of the main reasons was the issue of the post-Shoah refugees in Europe, which were concentrated in refugee camps, and he was in favor of allowing them to migrate to a Jewish state in the region. For Moscow, the things were different. USSR and all the communist countries of the creating bloc at that time voted in favor because Moscow thought that a Jewish state could serve more its geopolitical purposes. Moscow, from Peter the Great onwards, has always dreamt of having access to the Mediterranean Sea. One of the reasons why nowadays Putin is supporting Assad is because the relationship between Moscow and Syria are strong because of the Tartus naval basis. So the communists at the time thought that the Jews could be their own partner much more than the Arabs, because the majority of the Jews at the time in the elite was from former Russia. We're talking about the migration, were left-wing, were secular. So they thought that Israel could be a partner for communist policy in the Middle East. And actually things worked for a while until basically 1950 when Israel and the Soviet Union starts, because of the Korea War, detaching. So this is how basically the UN voted for the partition plan, November 47.
Right.
Now it's my turn for a question to Marcella. So this is the decision. Now what comes after that? Which are the reply by the Jews and the Arabs starting from November 29?
Okay, thank you very much. Well, the first thing to say is that starting from December 1st, meaning 2 or 3 days after, the two groups start shooting at each other in the country that has been partitioned, or that has been that the UN voted to partition. So the first thing that happens is the beginning of what we call a civil war between, not yet Israeli, between Jews of the Zionist movement and the Palestinians who lived, the Arab Palestinians who lived in the various cities and in the country. But I should also mention that while this civil war started, and the civil war, we call it civil war because both groups are within the same institutional framework, which is the British Mandate, which is not yet over. So during this period, there are also huge debates inside the two camps as to what to do with this partition. Shall we accept it? Both camps would ask, shall we accept it or shall we refuse it? And the story goes that the Zionist movement accepted it and the Palestinian movement refused it. But there's more to this in the sense that if we look at this map, and if you look at the one next to it, which is the distribution of the population by district, and you see that the darker the darker gray is Palestinian Arabs, and lighter gray is Jews. So you see that in no, with the exception of Tel Aviv, which is, I don't have a pointer, but is basically here. So this is Tel Aviv. With the exception of Tel Aviv, there was no majority anywhere of Jews in the country. And so you understand that in all other parts, Palestinians would be the majority. So if you compare these two maps, you see that in no part of this tripartite state, the blue, the yellow, and the white for Jerusalem, Jews would have had a majority, numerical majority. So, of course, if you're offered a deal like this, you can only accept because you start from a position of numerical inferiority to achieving, and that also goes for land ownership. You start from a position of inferiority to a much larger gain if compared to what the Palestinians were losing. If we look at the percentages, Jews get 56 point something percent of the land, while Palestinians or the Palestinian state would only get 42. So you can understand why one group accepts and the other one refuses. And so what we have immediately after the partition plan and the beginning of the civil war is also unfortunately, two defining massacres, two events which are terrible, that occur before the foundation of the State of Israel on the 15th of May, 1948, and the beginning of the international conflict, which is the one that immediately follows the establishment of the State of Israel. So the first massacre, and the two are connected, the first massacre is the so-called it actually happens in a village called Der Yassin, and that happens on the 9th of April, 1948. And you have here very controversial accounts of what happened and of the number of people who were killed. Der Yassin is today a neighborhood of Jerusalem. It no longer exists as a Palestinian village, and the neighborhood of Jerusalem is called Givat Shaul. And at the time, it was a Palestinian village, which had also pretty good relations with the Zionist movement. It was not on bad terms with them. But what happened was that the army that the Zionist movement was using, in which it was organized, was composed of various groups. And there were at least 3 groups. One of them was very right-wing, and it engaged in some activities that later would be called terrorist activities, or actually before were called terrorist activities. I don't know if you've heard of the bombing of the King David Hotel. So this group was called Irgun, which in Hebrew means organization, and it stands for Irgun Tzvai Leumi, which is a military national organization. So this Irgun entered this village and massacred a number of people and inhabitants, not razing the village to the ground, but certainly destroying everything that was alive in it. So the numbers vary, and really the numbers are not that important in the sense that whether it's 80 or 100 or 110 doesn't really make much difference, unfortunately, in the sense that this was the first awful massacre that happened, and that left a very, very strong impression and mark on Palestinians themselves, who started to flee, some of them voluntarily, some of them not, but in general started to flee out of psychological fear of what the Jews, as they were called at the time in inverted brackets, would do to the Palestinians. Inverted commas, sorry. So the reply to this massacre came a few days later, on the 15th of April, so a week later. And this was another awful massacre that was done at the hands, by Palestinians against a convoy. Jerusalem was separated at the time. It was divided and separated. So the lower part of Jerusalem was cut off from Jerusalem is very hilly and has a lot of hills. So from an eastern part of Jerusalem, where there was the university, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and an hospital. So there was a convoy, escorted convoy that, was doing its rounds from the lower part to the upper part of Jerusalem. This convoy was attacked, ambushed and attacked, And numerous people found death there, and the British did not intervene to separate the two. It was another horrible episode. But this is just to say that even before the international conflict started, in the day after the establishment of the State of Israel, the situation on the ground was totally compromised, and these two competing nationalisms, about which we've been talking earlier on in the other room, found this is the moment when they clashed, and only one of them would survive, in fact. And so I'm just saying this because this really sets the scene for the war that will start a few months later, for the international war. So this is also, I think, the moment in which we should maybe think about how a refugee problem starts. And so we have, as I said, two phases at least, the civil and international conflict. And the Deir Yassin moment is when the first Palestinians start to flee. And now, the question of the creation of the Palestinian refugee problem is a rather complicated one, and it has different perspectives, and is seen differently according to who writes or who talks about this. So I'm not going to, there are different, historiography has talked a lot about this. And let's say that in the first part, in this first moment of civil war, you have a number of Palestinians fleeing from...
Maybe you could clarify the difference between civil and then the international conflict in terms of dates, no?
Yes, in terms of dates. So the civil war, it's between 29th of November 47 until the 14th of May 48, which is the day before the foundation of the State of Israel. The State of Israel is established on the 15th of May 1948, and the day after you have the invasion of 6 Arab armies plus the Arab Liberation Army, which is a volunteer army that moves in from Jordan. I think I have a map, there it is, moves in from Jordan, and actually the Arab Liberation Army has already entered during the time of the civil war, okay? So it's 6 Arab armies, which is all those surrounding, so it's Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Egypt, did I say Egypt? Yeah. Egypt, Lebanon, and, well, let's start again. And Iraq. Iraq is not, doesn't have a border with Israel and Palestine, but, and on top of that, we have the Arab Liberation Army that moves in from Jordan before 1948. So these are the two phases. Now, in these two, before the international conflict starts, so before this map, we go back one, we already have the beginning of a problem of refugees, of movements of refugees in Palestine. And these are not people who are, it's very difficult to say who has been evicted at gunpoint and who has fled because of psychological fear, or who has been convinced or forced to sign a paper that he will renounce to his property. It's, it should be investigated case by case, village by village, and some have done it. But talking in general, we can say that in this first part of the civil war, in this first part of the war, which is the civil war, a number of Palestinians flee out of their own will or in fear of losing their properties or their houses or their lives. And these are the most educated and the first to go in an international crisis are always the most educated, those who have the means, those who have relatives somewhere else. But we're not talking of small numbers here. We're talking of 20,000 people from Haifa, for example. We're talking about 40,000 from Jaffa. It's already 60,000. We're talking about 10,000 from Jerusalem. And when the leadership, the intellectual or professional leadership of a country leaves, all the other ones are left with no guidance. And, Palestinian society, like any other society, was dynamic and had different groups. It had peasants as well as professionals, as well as entrepreneurs. It is not the idea of that the Palestinians were just peasants with their fields and olive trees. They were an articulated society. So the moment the leadership leaves, then the rest of the country is left without, the left of the people are left without a guide. And so this makes the situation rather complex. Also, Palestinians had bodies of self-government, like the Arab Higher Committee that had been established during the Mandate period. But the Arab Higher Committee had no means to stop such an exodus, if you like, or such a flight. And that was because most of the people who were part of the Arab Higher Committee were the ones who fled. And so, so this is the beginning of the story. Then the story changed, because in this period of the war, the Zionist, say the armies, the three military bodies that I mentioned, were not having many successes, I would say. It was a very hard time from the point of view of military developments. In fact, Jerusalem was under siege, it was isolated. It's called the time of the Battle of the Roads, when the Zionist military groups were trying to have controls of the roads, that connected the various parts, and they were losing. They were losing on all fronts. And so in this context, they all knew that the moment the British would leave, the Arab states, the neighboring Arab states would send their armies in. And in this context, the Zionist leadership, military leadership, devised a plan, which is called Plan D, or Dalet. Okay, so which means that Aleph, Bet, Gimel, so Dalet is the fourth letter of the alphabet. It means that the first three plans weren't very successful if you need the fourth one. Now, the problem of this Plan D is, this is a very controversial question, because there have been various interpretations of what this Plan D was. Whether it was, the idea was to have an internal front which would be clear of enemy forces within the country's border. If we translate this, it means we don't want Palestinians inside our lines of defense, right? So this is what the Plan D says. The question is, what do you do with this? I mean, how do you behave on the field with Palestinians who were in their villages? I don't know if has anybody been to Israel or Palestine? Okay, so you know the geography. I mean, some of you know the geography of the place, and you know that it's very, like, hills and lands are very mixed up. In a way, they're continuous. It's not that one part is hilly, one. So if, for example, you need to defend one area, you often had the village in the valley and a settlement like a kibbutz on a hill. And so in order to establish a continuity in defense, you need to pacify, let's say, in inverted commas, you need to pacify the Palestinian villages on your way. So you can understand that this leaves open various possibilities of interpretation. There have been various debates on this. Have you ever heard the name of an historian called Ilan Pappé? Okay, so I'm going to give you three names. The first one is called Benny Morris. Benny Morris is an historian, an Israeli historian. He was one of the first that in the 1980s went into the archives, dug up new documents, and decided that he dug up the Plan D, in fact, and he decided that the Plan D was the result of military operations, full stop. There was no intention of ridding, if you forgive me the expression, of Palestinians from the land. That was his conclusion. And he wrote a massive book that then he rewrote a few years later, The Creation of the Palestinian Refugee Problem, 1987, Cambridge University Press. A few years later came another historian called Ilan Pappé, who was much younger and who built on the research of Benny Morris to say, well, no, hang on. This was not just a military plan. This was ethnic cleansing. And this led to genocide. So you see, it's a completely different interpretation. So we have the same problem, but the same document, but two different interpretations of that. And the book that he published, which was called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, was extremely successful and raised a number of questions and a big debate. Third and last came another historian, Israeli, called Alon Confino, who framed this whole problem in the framework of forced migrations, which at the time were fairly common. I mean, if you think about Korea that you mentioned, and the number of refugees that existed throughout the whole of Europe. So he said, well, the Palestinian refugee problem was just another case of forced migrations in history. There have been many, and there's another one. So basically, this was his idea. So, So this is this is what happened. Now, the number of Palestinian refugees is also controversial. If you look, Benny Morris, who's the first one who tackled this problem, as I said, he said that the number of Palestinian refugees in total were between 650,000 and 700,000. 750? Yeah. Between 650 and 750 refugees, 700,000 refugees, excuse me. Of course, numbers vary. The Israeli official position is 500,000. The official position in Arab countries is 900,000. And here you see in this map, you see this is a summary map of all the directions where Palestinian refugees went. And it belongs to different parts of the war, of the different moments of the war. But as you can see, a large number of refugees went from the center of the country to what are today the occupied territories. If we go back to this map, which maybe, oh, yeah, okay, from what was meant to be the Jewish, sorry? Grazie, very kind. From what was meant to be the Jewish state in blue, they went to the Palestinian state there, which is the yellow one. So the idea was to, the fate of the war was not yet decided. So if you have to move, you go to where you think there might be a state for you. And so that's where many refugees went. Other ones, you see a big arrow goes down to Gaza. Well, he anticipates me. He even knows what I'm going to say. That's fantastic. We really have wireless connection. And to Gaza, thank you very much. And also, and where to? Let me see. No, I'm not sure. I want to say that from the north, many of them went to Lebanon, as you can see up there. So another unintended consequences, dramatic unintended consequences of this situation is that with the potential end of one diaspora came the beginning of a new one. And that's the beginning of a new Palestinian diaspora. So I think that I've spoken too much. Maybe you should tell us something about those who stay and who remain.
Okay, let's say that from the new created territory of Israel, do we have a map of? Yes. So in the second, in the central map.
Yes. For you.
So basically, at the end of the war, we have a creation of the Israeli state, which is the blue plus the purple areas. So 150,000 Arabs remained, or non-Jews remained in the newly established Israeli state. Most of them were from the countryside. As Marcella was saying, once the leadership left, the poorer remained without guidance. So basically, the vast majority of people who were living in towns, they left. So the big Arab towns were completely depopulated. For example, Ramla, for example, Lidda, which were in the center of the country, Ascalon, they were all big Arab cities, and they were completely depopulated. The only Arab city which remained was Nazareth in the north. And actually, the vast majority of the Arabs or the non-Jews who remained in the new state were concentrated in the upper part of what is actually called Galilee. And as I said, many from the countryside didn't leave because they didn't really have any means, and they didn't want to leave the small piece of land and the small house. So this is why even nowadays, the vast majority of the so-called Palestinian citizens of Israel are concentrated in the Galilee, in the many, many small towns and villages in the north. I want to pick up another name of another historian called Lila Parsons, who teaches at McGill's University in Montreal. And why am I quoting her? Because she has written an interesting book on the Druze. Because the main question that Lila Parsons raises is if the Plan Dalet, Plan D, wasn't implemented strictly, so there was not ethnic cleansing, but as Benny Morris says, the refugees are a product of the war. So where there was clashes, people left. Where there were no clashes, people didn't leave. Why does all Druze remained? This is what Lara Parsons asks. Not only those who didn't fight, but also all those who fought, while Arabs, Christians, and Muslims who didn't fight also left or were expelled or were deported. This is a problematic term. And what Lara Parsons says is actually that there was at least there was one decision from the government to talk with the Druze leadership and to agree that the Druze would remain because they trusted the Druze to be loyal to the country. So in the end, if we think that around 700,000, 750,000 left, 150,000 Arabs remained in Israel. What happened to them? Well, it was not an easy life for them. Because the fear that they could represent a danger for the security of the state was very heavy, and therefore they were put under military law. And they remained under military law from 1948 to 1966. What did military law mean? It meant that they could not move from one city to another city without a permission issued by the Israeli army. That they could not participate in the political life, they could not create autonomous political parties, that they could not join trade unions, so they should remain in their own specific area with a citizenship that was not, let's say, full citizenship as those of the Israeli Jews. And also in terms of citizenship, it was not very easy for them to get the Israeli citizenship. In 1952, the law how to get Israeli citizenship was adopted by the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, and that law was taking into consideration a previous law, which is 1950, the so-called law of return, which was granting citizenship to any Jew from the world who wanted to get the Israeli citizenship. The 1952 law was providing citizenship to all those who were resident in Palestine before 1948 and that had not left, but they should demonstrate that they were resident. It was not very easy for the Arabs to demonstrate that they were resident before 1948. This is why it was not simple for them to get citizenship, and some of them only got citizenship, the Israeli citizenship, in the 1980s. So also for them, it was, so if for the refugees, the Palestinian refugees, of course, it was a very difficult life because they were all over the refugee camps in the neighboring countries, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria. Also for the Israeli Arabs, it was not simple because they were under military law, but they were also completely detached from the rest of the Arab countries. Israel didn't have any diplomatic relationship with any Arab country, so they were basically left alone without a guidance, without a political leadership, without contact with other Arab countries, and things would remain difficult until 1966, when the military law was lifted. But of course, things would really immediately change the following year, 67, with the new war, the Six-Day War, and the occupation of the Palestinian lands that have remained outside of the Israeli territory, mainly the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. So this is basically what is happening during the war and after the war. Marcella, do you want to ask me something else?
How does the war end, maybe?
Okay, we try to do this, and I'm not sure this will work in terms of...
Shall I say how the war ends? Do you want to say how the war ends?
No, you can say that, and I can reply.
Okay.
No, I can reply to your question if you want.
Yes, you start. How did the war end?
Okay. The central image, the central map, is the picture of basically March 1949. The so-called 1948 war actually lasts, as we have said, from November 29, 47 to basically March 1949, when the last armistice with the neighbor countries is signed in Rhodes. So Israel didn't sign a peace treaty with Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. They only signed armistice, which meant that the war was over, but there were no diplomatic relationship with the neighboring countries. The 1948 war had a huge impact on the entire Middle East. The Arab countries had decided to attack Israel, to join the war for several reasons. If I may quote a small article by a guy called Michael Eppel, published on Middle Eastern Studies, a long title, The Arab States and the 1948 War in Palestine, the Socio-Political Struggle, the Compelling Nationalist Discourse, and the Regional Context of Involvement. Sorry for the long title. This is a 30 pages article which tells us why the Arab states decided to enter the war. And if we want to get out of one sentence that has in the 50s and 60s been used by the historiography that they wanted to destroy the Jewish state, Michael Eppel says that the Arab countries decided to attack Israel for two main reasons. First of all, internal reason. The leadership didn't want to tackle very difficult problems that they had, unemployment, the lack of agrarian reform, so there was a huge socio-economic problem that the leadership was not able really to tackle. And so they decided to use the nationalist discourse, the Palestine card, to basically give that to the public opinion to move their attention towards a discourse, a national discourse. But also, no one of the Arab states wanted to let the other be more powerful. If we think of those who entered the war, Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq, each country was afraid of the others. Saudi Arabia was very much afraid of Transjordan, of King Abdullah. They were afraid that King Abdullah could really, had the partition being implemented, that Transjordan could basically take over the Arab state. And that was a risk. The Hashemites were two dynasties ruling over Egypt and over Transjordan. They were really at odds relations with the Saudi Arabia for previous reasons. If I may say, we were mentioning Hussein Sharif of Mecca a few minutes ago. Once the Saudis took over the entire Arabic Peninsula, creating Saudi Arabia, the sons, the descendants of Hussein, the Hashemites, took over Transjordan and Iraq, so there were very harsh relations. At the same time, Egypt was very much afraid that Transjordan could not only take over the Arab state, but also, in a way, taking over Syria, which was quite messy and had some political problems. So each country basically entered the war because they were afraid of the others. So King Farouk was afraid of Abdullah. Abdullah was afraid of
King Farouk of Egypt.
Of Egypt was afraid of Abdullah. Abdullah was afraid of Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia. So they basically entered the war not to let the other take over the newly created yet to be created Palestine Arab state. So once the war was over, of course, it was not simple for them to say to the public opinion, look, we have basically failed. And the main consequences of the 1948 of the region are several coups d'etat that happens in 1949, 1950, 51, 52. Syria went through three main coups d'etat in 1949. because of course the Arab Syrian populations wanted those reforms to have a better economic and social economic lives. 1951, King Abdallah is killed by a Palestinian who basically thought that Abdallah had made as it is called, collusion with Israel. And 1952, there is the coup d'etat by the free officers in Egypt against Kid Farouk. So the main consequences of 1940, so how does the end of the war? The war ends with the creation of Israel and the Gaza Strip under Egypt control and West Bank under Jordanian control, but the main consequence is a huge turmoil in the Arab countries that they joined the war. So this is, in a way, the regional consequences of the 1948.
Can I add just one?
Yes.
Yeah, just one thing. First of all, the armistices that were signed in Rhodes, they were all signed separately. So the State of Israel signed a separate armistice with Lebanon, with Egypt, with Syria. So that also tells you how separated these armies were and how much there was a lack of coordination on the battlefield between these different countries who attacked, as Arturo said, also for their own interests and to rival the other. But also, as you were speaking, a movie just came to mind. I don't know if you've seen The Time That Remains by Elias Suleiman, who's a Palestinian film director. And The Time That Remains starts with the War of 1948. And this is a very surreal film, and it's also very sarcastic at some points. And you have the scene of, I can't remember where, in the north of Palestine, you have these guys these men during the war, sitting at a cafe, Palestinian men, and then an Iraqi soldier arrives running, and the Iraqi guy says, where do I go for Haifa? This way? And all the other ones turned and said, no, the other way. And so it's like these armies that invaded had really very little knowledge or care, for that matter, of what they were fighting for. While from the point of view of the Zionist movement and of the State of Israel at that point, the factor of motivation was really very, very strong. Remember that we are in 1947, so the gates of Auschwitz has just actually opened 2 years before. So if the State of Israel, just declared State of Israel, would have been defeated there too, or there, there was really, it would have been a massive blow to, in terms of identity, of life, of the possibility of a collective rebirth. So that's also important. I think that we should also mention that Jerusalem, that you see over there, ends up divided. In blue, you have the Israeli Jerusalem, which is West Jerusalem, and in yellow or brown, you have the old city and East Jerusalem, and that remains separated by a wall between 49 and 67, when the Six-Day War will lead to what the international community calls the occupation of East Jerusalem, and then ultimately, later on, to the annexation by Israel. But between 48 and 67, this is the division of the city. And I think we should also mention that if we look at the map in the center, two things. First of all, let's look at the first two maps. You see the UN Resolution 181 and the end of the war. You see that the territory that the State of Israel conquered during the War of 48 is larger than what had been assigned by the UN partition proposal of 1947. And this is interesting in the sense that while the international community recognized map number 1, the international community today is considered to be the legitimate border of the State of Israel is map number 2. So a portion of the State of Israel was conquered during the War of 1948. And the second thing that I wanted to say is that the territories that are today the occupied Palestinian territories were actually Jordan at the time. So between 48 and 67, they were Jordan. And they were not occupied, they were annexed by Jordan. And that makes that's a huge difference in general. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
Maybe you can point at Hadassah and the
Yeah,
Mount
you see
Scopus.
it says of it up there in the last map, Israel delimitarized zone, and it says underneath Hadassah Hospital and Hebrew University. So the idea was to go, I mentioned the convoys that would go from downtown, let's say Jerusalem, uphill. So the convoys would have to go around the whole, the old city up to the hill over there. So the ambush was after the whole city, moving east on the road. So if you go there, there is a monument today with all the names of, I think it's 79 people who died. And interestingly enough, if we take these two events, sadly enough, I should say, these two events that I mentioned, which are the massacre of Deir Yassin and the Mount Scopus convoy attack, for one, there is a monument, and for the other one, there is not only there is nothing, but the whole area was sealed. And today is the it's a psychiatric hospital, and it's sealed up. Nobody, only a BBC troop has been there in the 80s to film, but there's a movie being done on this, which is called Forgiveness by an Israeli director called Udi Aloni. That it's not filmed there, but tells the story of this rather disquieting place.
Before asking something else to Marcella, just let me add one more thing. Given that the Hebrew University was, it basically remained outside of the Israeli territory, this is why another university was created at the campus, Givat Ram, which is nowadays part of the university. Marcella was mentioning the issue of remembering. So we have a monument to commemorate the Hadassah massacre, but we don't have anything to commemorate the Deir Yassin massacre. So my question to Marcella is, how do we now remember, how do we commemorate the 1948 in Israel, from the Palestinian and from the Israeli side?
Yes, 1 second only. Let me just open this website. Yes, okay. So the issue of, and then at some point you have to stop us because we can go on forever. You know, this is what we do normally for a living. So now the issue of remembering and of narrating, of telling the story of 1948, it occurs at different level. I mean, there is a question of individual memory, of family memory, of collective memory, and each group would have his own. And so you have here conflicting, I mean, a war, conflicting memories of this war. So I will skip all the part on, you know, school texts and how education plays a role. But for example, it's also interesting how cinema plays a role in this. Have you all seen Exodus? Or do you know about the movie Exodus with Paul Newman, 1940, I don't know, early 50s, that tells, it's a Hollywood movie about Jewish refugees arriving from Europe and arriving in Palestine just before the beginning of the 1948 war, and it tells a very heroic story. And this movie has shaped the perception of the War of 48 for a long time, for example, in the US, but not only in the US. So I will skip all the part on, you know, school books, textbooks, and how like a certain narrative is promoted and portrayed in both camps, how each camp promotes his own, their own narrative, goes without saying. But I would like, given that we don't have much time, I just wanted to point you to this website and organization, which is called Zochrot. Zochrot means we remember in the feminine form. And it's a challenge, in a way, to the normative accounts of war and to the perpetuation of these narratives of enmity that are told in schools and organizations and in families as heroic narratives, if you like. Because the problem with 1948 is really that it is the heart of is the nucleus of the narrative of enmity that each group tells each other and against the other. So Zochrot started with a question of remembering on the land, because if when you go, or who has been to Israel, I'm sure you have noticed a lot of like ruins of houses around, And so these houses are now an archaeology of the war of 1948, if you like. For example, just before you enter Jerusalem from the highway, there is a village which is called Lifta. And Lifta, there's also a movie, The Ruins of Lifta, which is on Canopy that you can all access from the NYU website. So Lifta is one of the best preserved archaeological remains of the war of 1948 because it all has, all the houses are still intact. And so Zochrot started by putting signs on the you know, where these villages were, yellow signs. Let's see if I find any picture here. Naming, I'm not sure, naming the places with their names. So I'm just looking, let's see if I see anything here. No, but anyway, if you browse the website, I'm sorry, I just don't want, if you browse the website, you will see, let me just, this is the name of a village maybe here. No, okay, there's also an app called Ainakba, and you can download it, and you know, you point on each village and it will give you the history, which is the same thing of this one. So Zochrot is doing on the web and on the, maybe here, last attempt, well, whatever. So these are the remains I was talking about. And they would just go around putting yellow signs, signaling that that was a Palestinian village with a given name, and that it exists on the territory. It should not be forgotten. Of course, this kind of activity has encountered multiple opposition from opposite groups who actually are going to always take out the same yellow signs. But ever since, I mean, since the year 2000, when Zochrot was first founded, Zochrot has developed a number of other activities. And one of them is called, focuses on the idea of return. And I will tell you what this idea of return is for Zochrot, which is a very left-wing and active organization.
Is it joint?
No, it's not joint. It's only Israeli.
Arab Jews.
Yes, but it's not Palestinians from the West Bank, and it's only Israelis. Now, I just brought these two books from home because I just live nearby and I thought it would be useful. In the 1990s, as Israeli historiography was developing, you know, this new historians idea with Benny Morris and all these things that I said, some Palestinian historians also decided to tackle the issue of their own memory and the memory of the Palestinian villages on the land. And so one of them, who's Walid Khalidi, I'm going to pass this on, compiled this volume, which is entitled All That Remains, which is a sort of a book of memory of the Palestinian villages destroyed or depopulated or you know, left, abandoned, whatever, depends on the village. And this is a very detailed study on village by village of what happened, what remains, and this is, it's an important step for all these kind of activities like Zochrot and other groups, so that all these other organizations can undertake this kind of activities, because that's a sort of a phone book, if you like, if you pass me the term, an index of all that used to be and that no longer exists or exists only in the form of an archaeology. So just to, so Zochrot, as I was saying, is a very active NGO. Here is the Ainakba app that I was mentioning, but it also has this question of return, because the right of return, as you know, is one of the crucial points of Palestinian history, if you like, the idea that they have the right to return to their former properties and lands. But for Zochrot, who, as I said, is quite radical in its approach, return is a more philosophical concept, is the idea that Israelis should, that return starts before the Palestinians actually step back into Israel at the moment, but starts with the idea that Israelis should accept the idea that Palestinians can return, which is interesting. And what Zochrot also does is, have you ever heard of something called transitional justice? Transitional justice is when you have a regime that has done a number of abuses, and then the regime changes, and in this transition you have to make justice for the crimes or abuses that were committed by the previous one. So, for example, the South Africa Truth and Reconciliation. No, it's not reparations. It's a form of, reparation is part of transitional justice, but the idea is broader, is that you should address the crimes, according to which country you were talking about, that have been committed in order to initiate a new phase, basically, so to acknowledge the faults. And so this is what Zochrot is also doing, is collecting testimonies so that the two groups could confront one another. This is a very radical group, and nobody really, not many are following this step. And I'm not saying it's the right one. I'm just thinking, I just wanted to point out that this also exists. And it's an interesting way to address conflicting memories. And the idea that maybe some reparation or retribution or justice is needed is also part of this discourse, which I think it's important. So I don't know, do we have anything? So I think we've spoken enough. So thank you for your patience, and if you have questions, or I will be happy. Yes. Yes.
Oh, thank you. And so a big part was we were talking about what was the other? It was Deir Yassin, and the other. What was the other one called?
No, what's that?
You said there was Deir Yassin, and after Deir Yassin, on April 3rd.
The Hadassah convoy massacre.
Okay, and so I just thought it was interesting because, like, a point I remember, like, in the past when I learned about Deir Yassin and the other.
Hadassah. Yeah.
I'll say Hadassah. Thank you.
Yeah.
That, like, following Deir Yassin, there was an apology, like an acknowledgement from the Jewish Agency of Israel,
Yeah.
Haganah, to the King of Jordan, saying, like, this is, like, we acknowledge that this was
Yeah.
a wrongdoing, and then following after we had the Hadassah, thank you, attack, and then there's reports of Orthodox Jews having demonstration outside saying, like, we don't want this anymore. There's a ceasefire, and, like, we don't want this, and
We don't want this as in.
meaning, like, because following the
Okay. I didn't know for the state of the conflict.
following the Deir Yassin attack, because there was a rebuttal from the Jordan king, which said, like, if I remember correctly, the exact quote in English is, like, that there will be a consequence if, like, it keeps happening, and that's what, like, and I just thought it was interesting because transitional justice is, as you said, about addressing the crimes that happened, and that was an attempt of Israeli, like, leadership addressing a crime that they've done. So I just thought it was interesting that, like, that just a point to point out.
Yeah.
And then I had a question, something that you mentioned about at the time in 1947, it was hard to join, like, the government and other areas without permission, as it is in even Italy today. Like, for example, Italy always talks about how immigration is, and it's one of the, it's so hard to get citizenship here. I remember talking about that in social foundations if we're going to take it back to our classes. And so I just thought it was interesting, like, why that was such, like, because, like, anywhere, for example, where there's an immigration issue, I feel like it's impossible to, not impossible, but it's hard. And so why was that, like, just really emphasized in the, I just want to, like, ask why that was so emphasized in the sense of, like, yeah, it's hard to gain citizenship, but just.
You're talking about the Palestinian support for the.
Okay. Yeah.
Can I just say something about? Yes, not only did the Jewish Agency actually apologize, but, for example, you have various letters from notable Jews, let's say Albert Einstein, for example, writing a furious letter to the leadership of the Yishuv, condemning outright this kind of massacres. And, but as I mentioned earlier, there were at least 3 armies, and one was called the Haganah and Palmach. They were together, and they were the left-wing group, and then this one was called Irgun and was right-wing. So there was a conflict between these 2 different ways of not only seeing what what the state of Israel would be, but also how to treat the Arab population. There were just 2 very different ideological approaches. And so now there are interesting ideas about to what extent were this difference really real or just told? But this is a different matter. But the Deir Yassin massacre was a terrible event that occurred to that extent only once, and it was definitely the fault of certain groups. Now, no army can live, no state can win a war with two armies, and in fact, immediately after the foundation of the State of Israel, all the Irgun members were jailed for various reasons and in various ways. But this doesn't mean that other Palestinian villages were not depopulated, but that was really a horrible event that caused a very fierce reaction against it. I'm not sure that it is an apology, and I'm not sure it can be considered an act of reparation in the sense that then things went on and the war went on. So it's a different dynamic. It's not a change of regime. You're in the course of a war. But I take your point. Yeah, it was a first step. Yes. On the other hand, enclosing transforming Deir Yassin afterwards into a psychiatric hospital and sealing the whole area maybe was not the best way to address the fact that something terrible had happened there.
In terms of the citizenship, I wanted to mention that with the 1952 law, the Israeli citizenship was given to all those who had been residing in British Palestine before 1948 and had not left. But they had to prove, people who were there had to prove that they had been citizens of the Palestinian Mandate, they had documents, and in many cases, Arabs didn't have any more the documents because they had got lost or because they were, and I forgot mentioning, some of them were called IDPs, internally displaced persons who could not go back to their houses even though they were living in the Israeli state. So while for the Jews they could still take the citizenship through the law of return, the Palestinians could not. And that was difficult. So for some was also harsh from the juridical point of view. They could not get the citizenship until the 80s when things were solved and all of them could get it back, not back, could get it because it was simply according to the law.
I wanted to ask about the role of the surrounding Arab countries in perpetuating the Palestinian refugee crisis, which is something that I think probably originates with this competition during the 48 war, and whether they had Palestinian interests in mind at all, whether if the Arab countries had won the war, there would be a Palestine today, or whether it would just be Jordan or Syria or Lebanon, whatever. Also, I've heard many times in pro-Israel circles a statistic that said that approximately as many Palestinians left leading up to and during 48, as many Mizrahi Jews were kicked out of Arab countries, and the difference was that these Mizrahi Jews were absorbed into Israel, kind of, versus the Palestinian refugees were not absorbed into the Arab lands that took them and are still considered refugees and have a different refugee status under UNRWA than any other refugees in the world. What is the role of UNRWA and of the Arab nations in perpetuating this status, and could they alleviate it or help if they wanted to?
Okay, so I leave the Mizrahim to you.
Sure.
Yes, I absolutely agree. The Arab countries in many times have not supported the Palestinians as the discourse has said. In many cases, each Arab country has used the Palestinians as a tool for regional or international purposes. Coming to the refugees, I absolutely agree. Apart from for Transjordan, no other country gave citizenship to the Palestinians. They wanted to leave the Palestinians there to use them as a tool against Israel, to demonstrate Israel is guilty because of the Palestinians, and we are not solving the issue of the Palestinians because otherwise they would never go back. And then, of course, you have, so this is the general explanation, but then, of course, you have specific cases. And I think that one of the most interesting is Lebanon. The majority, if not the totality of the Palestinians, around 100,000 reached Lebanon. And the vast majority of them was Sunni. And in order to avoid the problem of demographic balance in Lebanon, none of them got citizenship and they remained in refugee camps. Only some Christians, well, all Christians were a tiny minority of the refugees got the Lebanese citizenship. So, and Lebanon never wanted to address the issue of the Palestinian refugees, and still nowadays the Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon are in a dramatic situation. I had the chance to visit Shatila, which is a refugee camp in South Beirut, and it is much, much worse than any other refugee camp in West Bank. Now, let's leave Gaza aside because it's really a dramatic situation. So no Arab country was interested in really giving the citizenship to the Palestinians, apart from Jordan. I'll go back to that in a second, in order to use them against Israel. Now, of course, things were different. In Syria, it was in a more, I mean, the Palestinians in Syria had a better treatment. They could at least work outside refugee camps. They could join schools, public schools. Syria paid for schools and universities. Lebanon is in the worst situation because of the demographic balance. Now, Jordan gave them citizenship, but not because of good heart of King Abdullah, later on King Hussein, but because, of course, Jordan was afraid of a Palestinian issue. So they wanted to Jordanize the Palestinians as much as possible in order to, I mean, allow the, I mean, to not to have crisis with the Palestinians, and also because for Abdullah it was very important to, for regional reasons, to demonstrate that Jerusalem is Jerusalem, and therefore the old city, and therefore Al-Haram al-Sharif was under its control. So the Jordanian citizenship was not because Jordan wanted to treat them better, but because of internal reasons. So certainly the Palestinian refugee issue has to do a lot with the Arab countries. Of course, I mean, I don't want to, I want also to I mean, let you know that IDPs Arab IDPs in Israel were not allowed to go back to their houses. Houses were destroyed by Israel until the early 1950s. We have cases of destruction of houses until the early 50s because also Israel didn't want to tackle the issue of those who were within its territory.
So to go back to the Mizrahim, not only, I mean, by Mizrahim, I mean Jews of Arab countries, coming from Arab countries. And this is a very broad definition in the sense that we go from Yemen to Morocco, and so we are talking about very different, I mean, population groups with different histories and with different relations to their neighbors. I mean, to their co-citizens, like an Iraqi Jew has a different history of relations with Iraqis than a Tunisian Jew with Tunisian, and so on and so forth. So first of all, I don't think we should use like the category Mizrahim as too broadly, because it's like talking about European Jews when you have Italian Jews who are different from French, from Russian, and so on. First thing. Now, Mizrahim are also victims of this situation in the sense that many of them, almost at the beginning of, in 1948, there were 900,000 Arab Jews, because this is what they were, in countries from Iraq to Morocco, to Morocco, and these numbers have been decreasing and decreasing and decreasing until there's virtually very few left, and 900,000 people left. 600,000 of them went to Israel, and 300,000 went either to France or to Canada, the United States, and so on. So these are all victims of this situation too, in the sense that many of them had to leave, being forced to abandon their properties, their assets, their jobs, their families, their I think that what the story tells is that it's the displacement, whether it's of Palestinians from the land they call Palestine or from an Iraqi Jew forcibly leaving Baghdad, is the disappearance of a culture, of a story, and it's a story of integration, of communality. I mean, we've been talking about, I'll get back to the Mizrahim in a minute, but we've been talking also in the room before, in the discussion group, about conflict and nationalism and opposing nationalism, but this is not the only way you can tell the story. For example, there's a book by an historian from the University of Florida, Michel Campos, which is called Ottoman Brothers, and it talks about relationship within the Ottoman Empire of Jews, Christians, and Muslims cohabiting, sharing festivities and occasions and eating together. And I mean, not everything is solved around a table in front of a meal, but it signals a familiarity of each other that disappeared. So this is happened in Iraq as well as in Yemen, as well as in Morocco and in Tunis, and all this disappeared. So I think that the really tragic, among the many tragedies of the story, is that really the disappearances of these human and daily relations that existed. Now, many Jews from different Arab countries were forced to leave and were absorbed in Israel for various reasons. Some of them were reasons of the rhetoric of the time spoke about the ingathering of the exiles, that is, bringing back all these the Jews exiled all over the world. The reality was a little bit different in the sense that they were certainly absorbed and they were certainly given citizenship and inserted in the political and social life of the country, but many of them were sent at the periphery of the country. Many of them were sent in the desert, for example, to colonize certain areas. And if you think about a family who was coming from Baghdad in 1940 to be sent to a settlement in the middle of the desert and to embody unwillingly the character of the pioneer, somebody who had studied at a French school or an English school, spoke 3 languages, had a profession, and so on. So yes, they were absorbed, they had professions, and they were part of a new nation, but many of them lived that as the beginning of a new diaspora. At NYU New York, there is a great film critic which is called Ella Shochat. Ella Shochat, she's in the film department. You'll find her, she wrote a great book on the representation. She was from a Baghdadi family, and she grew up in Israel, and she tells about her memories of being ashamed of her grandparents and parents speaking Arabic, because the new normative situation would be that the Arabs are the enemy. And so you can imagine the effect that this caused on a young girl that would be ashamed of the food that she would bring home, would bring to school, because the Ashkenazi Israeli kids would have other kind of things that wouldn't stink, like something fried according to a different culinary tradition, for example. So yes, they were absorbed. Unfortunately, they lost most of their properties, and they were also forced to flee, and they found a new home. But the price for this, for everybody, has been tremendously high and has been really terrible. I think it's the disappearance of these very rich cultures of integration. You remember when Professor Benny Hari from NYU Tel Aviv, he came here a month ago, something, to give a talk on Judeo-Arabic. And he said until, what was it, 1300s, most of the Jews of the world lived in Arab countries. 90% of the Jews of the world lived in Arab countries, and it's only now that we speak about Ashkenazi Judaism as being normatively the Judaism that we all know. Until then, it was Jews who lived in Arab countries. So you can imagine the history of integration. Huh?
Well, wasn't Jews living in Arab countries?
Yeah. You would say, I think that Sephardic is no longer considered to be the politically correct way of calling it, because it would imply an arrival from Europe, which originally it was. Yeah, it would be Spain. Sfarad is Spain. Ashkenaz in Hebrew would be Germany. Yeah. So they're rather called Mizrahi, meaning Mizrach means east. And the more courageous call them Arab Jews because they are Jews from Arab countries who spoke Arabic, who wrote in Arabic, and so on. We spoke too much. I think. Okay, so if you have other questions, we are here. If not, if you have other questions, there's a question there. Yes.
If I may, you mentioned the 48 war and the two primary reasons that the Arab countries or armies invaded, internal politics as well as the fear of each other. Was there any public opinion pressure within the Arab world which then continued to possibly 67 war, which didn't necessarily have all the same preconditions for the Arab armies to attack Israel? In other words, were there other dynamics in place that they couldn't stand by and see the refugees coming here and do nothing?
Well, in terms of public opinion, yes, there was a wide public opinion supporting the Palestinians against Zionists. Egypt is a very interesting case. In Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood, which was created in the late 20s, was very much supporting the Palestinian cause. And the main political party at the government, the so-called WAFD, couldn't really let the Palestinian cause in the hands of the Muslim Brotherhood. That's why, in a way, the political parties had to reply to the questions of a nationalist cause support the Palestinians, and therefore this is why, in a way, public opinion pressed the governments to intervene. The governments didn't wanted to, in a way, as I said earlier, put attention on something else compared to the socioeconomic issues. But also 1967, if I may, had lots of regional causes. I mean, it's a very problematic issue, but in a way, Nasser, at least this is what some historians say, felt compelled to do something in order to demonstrate its regional role compared to the Saudis. So the Saudis kept saying, "Why are you interested in Yemen and in? Why do you keep telling me that we are slaves of the Americans, why you don't have the courage to attack Israel, and you hide yourself behind the UN?" And in a way, so Nasser started acting also because he was afraid of the Syrians, and the Syrians were very much pro-Palestinian, so how could Nasser keep its regional role compared to the Syrians, who kept telling him, "Oh, you only talk and do nothing." So regional issues had its importance also in 1967. I mean, maybe this is my feeling, and this is what I like in some historiographic trends. But I would also say that regional issues very much have their relevance. I mean, if you think nowadays Saudi Arabia / Israel Entente, it has very much to do with the regional situation, which is Iran. So regional issues always play a role in this Israeli-Palestinian conflict, to me at least.
There's another question here.
I'll be quick. I saw they unveiled the snacks. I know that people talk about it in terms of, the Israelis versus the Palestinians and as these two cohesive groups. But would a future Palestinian state require groups like the Palestinian Christians and the Palestinian Muslims to come together into some sort of understanding, and Hamas and the PA to come together and unite in some way, or for one of those to go away? How could a cohesive, unified Palestinian state come together from the disparate parties within the Palestinian peoplehood that exist now?
No, I agree. I mean, I totally agree that if I had to say something concerning the nowadays politics, certainly you need to have Hamas and Fatah finding an arrangement in order to at least find a position to talk to Israel. And this is lacking. In terms of the presence of Muslims and Christians together, there's a huge discussion. I mean, starting from the mandate, Christians felt that they had to participate in the opposition to Zionism, and that's why several Christian Muslim associations were created in order to demonstrate that both of them were united against, or at least versus the Zionists. So in terms of Muslim Christians, things are complicated, but in a way, so far there is a united position, at least to request the end of the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories. Now, if ever that happens, of course, as I often say, the ball will be in the hands of the Palestinians, and they certainly have to make an agreement in terms of which type of democracy, which type of politics, which type of economics they want to pursue. And that would require all sorts of groups to have a common position. And that, of course, won't be easy. But in the meantime, and this is probably one of the problems, they can keep hiding behind the fact that Israel is still occupying, and occupation is not over, and therefore, I mean, let's see what's going on.
So it's another kind of situation where nothing for a while is going to happen, because each party is waiting for the other to change, or to something to change, to insert some change in the game, and it won't. It doesn't seem likely that it will happen, especially with, full stop. Yeah. So. Okay, in case...
Can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Last one. No, just, but they say a nice TV history transmission, Italian TV, that ends with a book, a place, and a movie. If you have to think, as a suggestion, a movie or a book or a place that you think might give the sense of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? I don't know.
No, thinking about various issues that have come up, I was thinking of, it's actually on 67, it's not on 48, but there is a book by an Israeli writer called Eli Amir, who's originally from Baghdad, whose family is originally from Baghdad, that is called Jasmine, and it's about the conquest of Jerusalem in 1967, and it's about the role that Jews from Arab country play in this new country that adopted them 20 years before, that is in the late 1940s, and how they feel that is their war, that they can prove, also through they can prove to the previous generations that they're also Israelis, but also through the relationship in Arabic with the Palestinians of East Jerusalem that they encounter on the battlefield. So it's a very beautifully written fiction book, and in Italian is published by Einaudi. It's called Jasmine, and in English I'm not sure, but I'm sure. Eli Amir. That's for the book. The movie, there are many.
There are many. If I may suggest a book?
No, yes, you may.
This, I think, a fantastic book by a journalist called Ari Shavit, My Beloved Land, 2013. I think it's a biography, but tells the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict according to him. And I really enjoyed it. It's not probably the term, but I really liked it. It's a very tough but good book.
Thank you very much, everybody. If you have more questions for us, over there at the pizzette. Thank you.